Today I want to share with you reflections on the gospel for the 11th Sunday after Pentecost. The gospel story comes from chapter 15 of Matthew's gospel. One thing to keep in mind always when we reflect upon the scriptures is that there are many different levels at which we approach the scripture, or many different levels that we can enter into the scripture. Remember always that the level of Jesus, the first level, is a level of first century Palestinian Judaism. It was a very complicated world in a sense, that the Jews found themselves free to practice their religion within the Roman Empire, but they were under the control of the Romans. They might have had a limited amount of independence during the time of Herod the Great, but by his sons, the Romans had now occupied the land for a couple of generations, and so had full control and full authority. The Jews living in Palestine, unlike the Jews living outside of Palestine in the rest of the Roman world, and we might call them Hellenized Jews, were more adaptable to the customs, the local customs, were more careful about the way that they were integrated into the local society. For Jews living in Palestine, there were those who were the strict hardliners, if you will. We might call them the people of Qumran, or the ones who really believed that Judaism would never be free and never be able to practice how it needed to practice until the Romans were driven out completely, until there was not just political independence, but also religious freedom. There were those who had accommodated themselves, and here we might talk about the Sadducees, who even began to take on Greek and Roman names instead of traditional Jewish names. They were the hardliners, in a sense, the Sadducees. They were the ones who believed in the strict interpretation of the Torah, and mostly just the written Torah, meaning that only what was contained in the prophets and the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, that was as far as they would go. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were ones who understood that if Judaism was going to prosper, thrive, and survive the Romans, that there needed to be some more, not accommodation to the Romans, but some more flexibility in the beliefs. Now, often the Pharisees in the Gospels are portrayed as the opposition to Jesus, and therefore the opposition to the early church. The Pharisees were the ones who believed in resurrection, and so it's very easy to see that Jesus would have adopted or would have liked that idea of resurrection. In any event, the Judaism of the first century is much more complex than we often reflect upon it. And so Jesus is speaking at his level to a Jewish audience, completely Jewish audience. By then, there was a group also within the Pharisees and the local community who were what we might call, and here Protestants might perk their ears up at this one, who were called the pietists. In other words, it was not only the strict interpretation of the Torah, but the strict discipline of the Torah. By the time the temple is destroyed, the customs or the rituals or the rules of Judaism were now focused and geared towards ensuring the survival of the Jewish people, so that various customs and traditions, and we hear it in the gospel today about hand washing and so forth, come not from Jesus's day, but from the next generation. So that's another level to the gospel itself. So Jesus speaks to a Jewish community. By the time his words come to the writers of the Gospels, and here we're looking at Matthew's Gospel, the audience has shifted a whole lot. So that now the words of Jesus that would have been spoken to a Jewish community, predominantly only a Jewish community, now are being spoken to a mixed Gentile Jewish community. So the gospel writer has to take the words of Jesus and apply them to his audience, which is very different from the audience of Jesus. To do so, he has to kind of not manipulate Jesus's words, but interpret Jesus's words, if you will. Another level, of course, is the later Christian community. And here, by another generation or so, by the time the Gospels come to be written down and in the form that they are, we're now dealing with another community, another audience who will hear not just the words of Jesus now, but will hear the words of Matthew's community, and now have to interpret 2 or 3 more levels. And of course, over the generations of time, from the Protestant reformers to the Catholic post-Reformation, to now us, you see how each generation is a different audience from that original generation of Jesus. And so we have to kind of, well, what does this mean for us? Do we take it literally as fundamentalism might, so that whatever Jesus said to a first century Jewish audience has to apply exactly literally to us today, which we see as kind of a little bit bizarre, if you will, or somewhat crazy to do that? How can we be held bound to the culture, to even the ethics of first century Roman Judaism? How can we be held bound to that today when human psychology and physiology and the whole understanding of the universe and the world is very different? So when we come to the gospel text on any one of these Sundays, not that any one of those we have to spend time talking about them as I've just done, but we have to kind of, where do we want to land? Do we want to land just in Jesus's day, or do we want to find a way in Matthew's community to land, to say Matthew's interpretation of Jesus's words as our interpretation? Or can we take both of those and now move it into the present? And so I want to see if I can do that for us. So the first part of the gospel today, if I can read it, Jesus calls the crowd together and says, "Listen and understand, it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles." The disciples approached him and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees took offense when they heard you say these things?" Jesus says, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if one blind person guides another, both will fall into a pit." But Peter said to him, "Explain this to us. Tell us, what are you talking about? What do you mean, Jesus?" Jesus says, "Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and that is what defiles. From out of the heart comes evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile." Now, this is a strange kind of text, and it might be one of those texts that are very difficult for modern people to understand and to grasp the sense of. But let's consider it this way. Again, the contrast that is being drawn is not to put it into the old Protestant Catholic version of law over grace, but to see that the invitation of the Torah, on one hand, is to observe what the words of the Torah say, that the commands are against fornication, adultery, theft, false witness. Yes, that's what the Torah says. But we take what the Torah says, and this is what I've come to understand about it, is that it's really about a way of life, how we live in the world, not just with reference to the commands and the Torah, but how we live in the world with reference to each other. What kind of moral life are we going to live? It's not in contradiction or in stark contrast to Torah and commandments and law, but it says we take what the Torah invites us to consider and we try to live them out in making choices and decisions that will reflect what the vision of God is about. And here, just keep in mind that when Jesus announces the reign of God is at hand, he's not calling for a reestablishment of the commandments and the Torah community. He's rather inviting us into the deeper understanding of God's presence, God's compassion, God being slow to anger, God being rich in mercy, God abounding in kindness. That's what the invitation of the reign of God is about. So that's a moral life. How do we create a world that reflects those realities and not just rules and regulations and rituals, if you will? And so the challenge of this first part is, are we going to stand in a world totally defined by the tradition, by the Torah tradition? Or are we going to see that we take that Torah tradition and not adapt it to the contemporary moment as a way of compromising what it says, but rather taking what the Torah invites us to consider and now shaping a world not as it would have been for Moses and the ancients, but rather how it's going to be for us today, that we can still have the spirit of the Torah in our lives, but that maybe we don't have to be held bound to the way that the Torah was instituted in the time of Moses, or even in the time of the Sadducees and Pharisees. And here's how Matthew begins to adapt it. Maybe that's not it, because Matthew had to be concerned that if in the Christian Jewish tradition that we were moving beyond the legal observance of the rules of the Torah to a more spirited understanding of living in the spirit of the Torah, as Paul might suggest it, then Matthew had to be concerned about the Jews in his community. That's fine for Gentiles to understand that. But Matthew had to be concerned, I've got people in my community that live their whole life in accord with the Torah commands, and now you're saying maybe that is of no value at all? So Matthew has to walk a fine line there. And that's why the suggestion is, it's not what comes inside that is so vile, but it's what we say outside, how we speak to one another. Wow. In this time of all the political rhetoric, it's so easy to demean and degrade people just because they are different from us, or hold different opinions, or have different ideas about how the world is to be shaped, how our country, how our lives are to be shaped. It's very easy to speak vile things of other people because of their skin color, because of their sexual orientation, because of their gender. And so the invitation here is that maybe we have to be much more careful, that faithfulness to the Torah is not so much anymore about observance of laws and rules and rituals and regulations, but the observance of the respect that we have to have, that the Torah actually is inviting us to consider the respect that we need to have for one another. And that's where it goes into the second part of this story. So let me read that to you. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer it at all. His disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, or she keeps shouting after us." She knelt before him, but she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. A couple of things behind this story. Within the Judaism of the day, in Palestine anyway, it was, as I said earlier, important that the Jewish identity was maintained. And you did that by setting up those boundaries and barriers, both politically, socially, economically, and religiously, that kept you pure, that kept you from being contaminated by the pagan, by the Romans, by others, by the other religions around you. And so the boundaries were drawn very closely. And here what you need to understand is that if you crossed outside of those boundaries, then you crossed into very strange territory, sort of like Alice in the Looking Glass, right? From the parables. But you crossed into territory that could contaminate you, and you might lose who you are as a Jew by being contaminated, either religiously or socially. I mean, if my community tells me not to associate with people who are unclean, or to eat unclean foods, or to engage in unclean activities, because that's essential to my identity, then I better observe that. And so when you hear Jesus crossing the boundary, the political boundary between Israel, if you will, and the territories of Tyre and Sidon, he's going into a non-Jewish territory, which carries all of those implications with it. Tyre and Sidon were ancient Phoenician cities, and then very powerful Canaanite cities. And there too, you need to know that both the Phoenicians and particularly the Canaanites were enemies of ancient Israel. They were the ones who fought against the kings, if you go back into the book of Kings and read the stories. And so they were a constant threat, maybe not militarily or politically at this point, but a constant threat. How can I associate with a Canaanite? How do I do that? And that's what's fascinating about the story, right? Just last week when Peter gets out of the boat, he calls out to the Lord, help me, help me. And Jesus says, okay, bro, I got your back on this one. Come to me. And Jesus grasps him by the hand. Jesus was ready to help his disciples. But this Canaanite woman, it's like, he wasn't even going to give her the time of day, was he? The challenge then in thinking about Jesus, and maybe this is pushing it somewhat in understanding Jesus, is even though Jesus is in the mindset of the reign of God, he's still a Jew. And therefore confined in all of that political, social, economic, religious baggage, clothing, that perhaps his mindset at this point in this story is, I'm a Jew, and this is a woman and a Canaanite. If I engage in a conversation with her, that poses a threat to my Judaism. So even though he had this larger understanding of the reign of God, he's still a Jew, bound by the culture, by the religiosity of the day, and that's what's fascinating about this. You see, those who want to hold on to the strictness of the Torah and the tradition find it difficult to change, right? How often do we hear that? We've always done it this way. This is tradition. And to do it any other way loses who we are, loses our identity, that we can't have a Zoom service. After all, we've only had services on Sunday morning. We can't even consider having service on any other day because it's only Sunday. That's the Lord's Day, as if none of the other days are the Lord's Day. And so we get locked into a mindset about tradition and about the way we've done it that closes us off to the possibilities and opportunities that God is working outside of that tradition or outside even of our community. And so when the woman approaches him, you see she's approaching him with one of the key ingredients of the reign of God. If somebody is in need of healing, if somebody is possessed by a demon spirit, then you have to respond to that. You can't ignore it, because the reign of God is about wholeness, about making whole the brokenness of the world, about setting free people who are bound. That's the focus of the reign of God. That's what it's about. And so this woman is asking something that is so essential and so much at the core of the reign of God that Jesus should have responded immediately, and yet he's unable to. He's stuck in the tradition and the culture and the religiosity of his Judaism, the Judaism of his day. And she persists. Boy, over the last few years we've heard that, huh? This is what tends to happen sometimes, especially for us men, is we tend to recoil at women who are aggressive, insistent, and persistent. And so that might be a little of what's going on here, that this woman is an unclean person because she's a woman, in addition to her being a Canaanite. And so Jesus doesn't want to give her the time of day. And think what Torah tradition that's exactly contradicting. If this woman is made in the divine image and likeness, it doesn't matter if she's a woman or a Canaanite. She's in the divine image and likeness, and therefore, by who she is, deserves respect. And Jesus doesn't give it to her. So she persists. She pushes Jesus with the idea of pushing him out of that mindset into the reality of the reign of God, if you will. Here, the preacher of the reign of God is unable to understand how to apply the reign of God to this situation of this Canaanite woman. And he kind of says, and it's such a strange thing because dogs and Jewish customs and tradition were unclean. For the Canaanites, it didn't matter, right? But he calls her a dog. How much more derogatory address can you give to her? And listen to some of our political ads and listen to some of the ways that people speak about others in such derogatory terms and language. She's a nasty woman. What? How do you know that? That's what Jesus is saying. This is a nasty woman. She goes, I know something about the reign of God that you may not even know, Jesus. That I'm as welcome in the reign of God as anyone else. And so she persists. Yes, that may be true. But even the dogs eat the crumbs. And that just sounds awful in my mind. That the crumbs, the leftovers of the reign of God, are given to those at the margins and edges, and that whatever is left over we give away, right? Whatever we don't think of, all the clothes in our closets that we give away because we don't need them or want them anymore. And so it's easy to pass them on to the poor because that's the leftovers. And so by the persistence of this woman, I have to think that Jesus stopped and went, oh my God, I've been so trapped in a culture and a tradition that I have failed to apply the reign of God in the way that I've been preaching and teaching about. I couldn't do it. How strong that prejudice and bias of Jesus is at that moment, that he couldn't transcend it to reach out to this woman who's asking something for her daughter. He failed. But she pushes him, and in pushing him, he is able to awaken that, wow, even the reign of God is for Canaanites and women. So it ends up being a story of inclusion into the reign of God. That Jesus is in foreign territory, in pagan territory, and yet the reign of God is as much for them as it is for anybody. In fact, it might be even more for them in the sense that the beauty of their own culture and their own way of life and their own morality, that God might be saying, I embrace that and welcome it. Maybe. But in any event, the story ends with that strange thing. Do we become so stubborn and so insulated by the desire to be the way it's always been, to hold fast to the tradition, to carry a mindset? How long did me out of the Catholic tradition and others out of the Protestant tradition think that the other was not going to heaven or couldn't be saved? How many Protestants still think that Catholics can't be saved? And how many Catholics still think that they're the only true religion? And unless you be... How many of us as Christians think that Jews have to be converted? How many of us don't even consider that Muslims or believers in God? How many of us are so quick to judge Hindus and Buddhists because they don't have our singular understanding of God, when yet their morality and the way that they understand life might be something that we could embrace, and it might ultimately enrich our tradition and our community, expanding it so that the fullness of God can be understood in that way. These are both challenging parts of the scripture today. And lots to think about, huh? That we continue to isolate ourselves, if you will, continue to wear masks so that we are safe. And you'll be hearing over the next few weeks for us here at Sun Lakes United Church of Christ of where our worship is going to be going and what we're going to be doing. So I just invite you, be open to the reign of God. Maybe try getting on Zoom the next time that we have a Zoom worship service. And please do look at our Facebook page, because our Zoom service from this past Wednesday is there. And I've posted a couple of other worship services from other churches so that you can see what other churches are doing in this time, other sister churches from the United Church of Christ. So please check them out and pray along with them as you also look at our Facebook and our Zoom worship service from this past Wednesday. Do consider how we're doing, how we're going to be doing this, what our future might be. I also invite you to pray in a special way for Judy Pete's son, Bob, and for their family as he went through a serious operation this past week. Pray for all of those still struggling with health, perhaps, with loneliness, with depression, perhaps, with anxiety. Pray for all of them. We can only do this together in the sense that we lift each other up, not put each other down, that we lift each other up. And so I want to end with the prayer from our worship service on this past Wednesday, our Zoom worship service, and just offer this prayer for you today as a way to carry us through the week. So I just want to pray with you. We've been joined to Jesus and the reign of God. And so I want to pray today that you continue to do the work of Jesus in the world in whatever way that it's possible to do that. Here's some ideas in our prayer. Extend a hand to those in need. Even just a phone call can do that. Speak up for those who are cast aside. We're living in a time when people are demonized because of their gender, their sexual orientation, their skin colors. Got to stop that, folks. That we speak up for those who are being cast aside. That we try to build bridges of reconciliation. That we strengthen the bonds of our community. That's what my prayer is today. Knowing that the maker of days, the restorer of our souls, and the breath of our lives is with us now and each day forward. And one final thing, exciting conversation I had with Rabbi Wiener from the Jewish congregation. We've got some things coming up, October, November, December, that we're going to join together in an interfaith dialogue and service. So watch out for those things. Look forward to those things. God's blessings be with you today. Stay cool, well hydrated. It is so hot out there. But inside is the cool Spirit of God.